Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Pleasure to follow after Tony, such an excellent talk. I'll get my apologies in. First, I'm an economist, and I'll pick up on some of the points that Tony mentioned about the failure of economics in the sense of understanding natural capital. So what I want to do today is try and give you the rationale for how natural capital became part of the Scottish economic strategy, how it's now part of our performance system, measurement system, why we think it's important, how it fits, and some of the journey that's taken place over that time period. Now, in thinking about natural capital, I think the term, as Tony alluded to, is really, really helpful. Business understand natural capital, economists understand capital. It's something that we're taught in the very basics of economics. So the term, this idea of natural capital, the use of that type of business language has really helped, I think, in getting people to understand what it's about and why it's important. So in thinking about it, we describe it simply as essentially what we get from nature. And we'll hear a lot today about the different benefits. Again, Tony alluded to some of them in the earlier talk. I suppose in the context of economics and natural capital and why it was omitted or not included, the economics profession, as you'll hear from Dieter Helm later, is equipped to deal with issues like natural capital. It's used to dealing with the problems of externalities, the problems of where costs aren't fully incorporated in price, where there's differences in the returns between private and social gains, and some of that relates to natural capital as well. We're quite comfortable thinking about that in terms of education, why the state fund education, because the wider social returns are stronger than the private returns the individual gets. So there's a framework there within economics that can apply and is readily made to natural capital, but I suppose the challenge is why hasn't it happened? Why is it only happening now? And that's something that's worth reflecting on in terms of the context of that and why it's important. So I'm the Scottish Government's Chief Economic Advisor. I've been an academic before I joined government in 2000, and my day job involves all aspects of the economy, providing advice on industry, what's happening in the macroeconomy, the microeconomy, resources, finance, taxation. And it's really interesting, my interaction with natural capital probably started around 5 years ago. It was gaining prominence in Scotland. We had a conference in 2013, which was opened by our previous First Minister, the World Forum on Natural Capital. And I think, as Tony said, its time has come, and its understanding was there. Now, like Ireland and other places, our agencies were involved in ecosystems, natural capital, biodiversity, different debates, but it kind of took that change in momentum. So that's by way of background. I've got some slides which I'm going to use just to kind of break up me talking down at you for the next kind of 20 minutes or so to give a flavour of the talk. But let me just kind of start with something around the point that Tony made about stocks and natural capital and what it actually means. So as I mentioned, from an economist perspective, we think capital is ingrained in how we think about the economy. So you have a capital stock, you get a flow of benefits from that stock. There's a realisation that you have to invest in the stock to have the continuation of the flow of benefits. Now, this is a kind of framework I pinched from another presentation, and a quote from Stiglitz, who's involved in the government's Council of Economic Advisors. But the point here, I suppose, is in a sense, is the importance of natural capital encompasses these. We are much more comfortable talking about economic capital, about financial capital. Social capital is becoming much more important following the financial crisis, the recession, about kind of social capital within communities. And human capital is a concept that we're all really comfortable with. So why not natural capital? And some of that, I think, is to do with the measurement, its interaction, understanding the value of it and how it actually relates. So let me just continue. Okay. So in thinking about natural capital, there's this element of the unseen nature, the unseen value of nature. When our First Minister spoke at the World Forum in 2015, she contrasted John Muir, who was from Scotland and was involved in the National Trust movement in America, with Adam Smith, who's often seen as the founder of economics. And she contrasted them because they had such a big impact in both their fields. And when I was listening to her, I was thinking, actually, she also probably missed another important point in the sense that a lot of what nature gives is invisible. And a lot of what Smith talked about was the invisible hand of the market. So in his world, markets worked because there was prices, which sent signals out that allocated resources, there was supply, demand. And so that was a very early description of a market, the role of prices. And so this kind of invisible hand metaphor, if you think of it in terms of nature, the invisible sense of nature, what it actually gives you. And if it doesn't necessarily need to have a price, but people have to understand what that gives you upstream and the benefits of that in terms of your economy, ecosystems, provisioning, regulation, maintenance, the whole effect. So that's by way some of the issues. I'll come back to the stocks and flows points as I proceed. Now, I want to kind of use this, I suppose, again, to draw the point out about the kind of traditional view of economics or whatever. I use these pie charts when I'm trying to explain changes in the economy over time. So we've got two pie charts here, one for 1973 and one for 2012. And what these show you is, as described by the National Economic Accounts, the contribution of sectors to GDP. So GDP is a classic case of the flow and stock point. But what we see here in a sense is you can pick up a number of points here. You can tell a story about how economies evolved over time from the early 70s when we were largely production-based, over 55% of activity, to 2012 where it's largely service-based. You can also look at the value of agriculture, forestry and fishing, little more than 5% in 73. In 2012, 1%. Again, but this is part of the problem with the natural capital and the metrics of using this type of approach. What we do know is when you look closer, when you look at what's left of manufacturing in Scotland, a lot of that is crucially dependent on natural capital, the benefits from fresh water, agriculture, pollination. If you look at our food and drink sector, it's really, which would be included within the manufacturing component, we have around 8.5 billion of exports from food and drink, 4.5 billion go out with the UK, 4 billion within the UK. So these are sectors that are crucially dependent on natural capital, and the provenance of the natural capital, the Scotland brand, how it operates within the sector. So this type of context tells you something about the economy. It doesn't tell you about the stocks. So what's happened to the stock of natural capital over that time? Some of the early work from Scottish National Heritage had looked at the changes in the capital stocks within Scotland, and there was difficulties with debates about how we measured it, and there was a view that essentially the stock declined until the 1990s, stabilised, increased a little bit, and I'll come on to how we measure natural capital. So I suppose, in a sense, the challenge for us is to integrate the economics with the ecology, with the environment, so that we understand the flows and benefits and what comes from the different sectors of the economy. So again, some further kind of thoughts around what we understand around the benefits of natural capital. So there's a primary industry there. We know we can count that. We know that there's employment. We know that there's tourism. We know that there's wider benefits to that. But again, what I would say with this type of thing, it's very descriptive and it doesn't capture the full benefits of natural capital in the context of what we would expect. So we've got some estimates of direct and indirect jobs. We've got upstream, downstream. We've got different values. But again, this is based on the economic terminology of natural capital and how it actually works. So that's by way of a bit of kind of background on natural capital in Scotland. So if you think about what I want to now talk a little bit about is how it became part of the economic strategy and its role within the economic strategy, what it actually means. And this has been quite a recent phenomenon, and my role in that. So I'm going to put a diagram up that kind of tries to give you a flavour of, this is the current kind of high-level economic strategy for Scotland. And you won't see natural capital in this diagram, but you'll see it in the next one that I put up. But the context for this is quite important. So the government came into power in 2007, and their purpose was sustainable economic growth with opportunities for all to benefit. So that was, most governments would have that approach. It was very much a growth-driven agenda, recognising that social cohesion, environmental cohesion were important, and that was 2007. In 2009, the Parliament introduced world-leading climate change targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions relative to the Scottish 1990 baseline level by around 80% by 2050, and also an interim target of 42% by 2020. So the low carbon part came in 2009. The strategy was updated in 2011 to reflect that. But obviously what happened over that period with the financial crisis of 2008-9, the kind of recovery, and now in 2015, with the change of First Minister, she wanted the strategy to reflect a different type of approach. So there's two pillars to this strategy. The right-hand side, competitiveness, is what you would see in all economic strategies. The difference, I suppose, here is around the tackling inequality and putting that alongside. It's almost like the strategy's turned on its side, and these are seen as equal pillars. And why that's important, I think that's important for natural capital as well, but why that's important in a sense was, at the macro level, the evidence was clear that inequality in advanced, if your focus was only on growth, inequality was bad for growth. And we were seeing evidence from the OECD, IMF, World Bank around the impact of social cohesion on economies from inequality. And also we know at the micro level that the people who suffer from income inequality, more deprived, tend to have poorer outcomes in health, education. They're more at risk from the impact of climate change. They tend to be impacted more. So that was the headline kind of change in the strategy, which was published in March 2015. And the middle bit is the bit about the strategy. If you don't believe that they're mutually supportive, then it doesn't work. And you could substitute that for natural capital as well. So I'm going to come on a little bit more about what this actually means. So there's 4 key drivers being identified: investment, innovation, inclusive growth and internationalisation. So that's the operation of the strategy. And inclusive growth captures this link between competitiveness and inequality. But the one we are particularly interested in is investment, because that's where the natural capital side comes in, and that's where the resource efficiency point is picked up. So a 4 kind of quadrant diagram. So as I mentioned, the 4 drivers, we have investment, innovation, inclusive growth and internationalisation. If you look at the top right quadrant, which I can't read from here, but it says natural capital, resource efficiency and low carbon. So why is that important that that's in there? If you go back to my very first slide about the traditional view of economic strategies, the types of capital that we measured, we tended to focus on economic capital, infrastructure, digital, human capital come into these strategies. But now, in a sense, what you've got is you've got natural capital and social capital. And social capital is really important also for dealing with the inequality issues. So the point about that being there, in a sense, is think about it as it's in the quadrant with the other stocks that you need for your economy. So it's recognised as something that has a value in terms of the flow of benefits it provides. It's within those stocks. If you take the very top one, education, skills and health, nobody bats an eyelid about the investment in human capital, the stock of human capital. We can monitor, we can measure, we know qualifications, skills, we know the different attributes. We know when to intervene in the education system. We have a big programme in early years for the under 3-year-olds. We know, and that's all about understanding how the actual stock and the flow of benefits links to the wider economy. And I think that's partly the challenge with natural capital, is getting that understanding and linkage within the strategy. The other 3 quadrants link to, again, innovation, internationalisation you would see in any economic strategy. The inclusive growth aspect is about who benefits from the strategy, the change, and the interaction of it. Some of these policies, I won't talk about them today, but for instance, the business pledge is about a voluntary code for businesses in Scotland to adopt particular practices in relation to the economy, around paying the living wage, no 0-hour contracts. So it's about behavioural change and thinking about that context. And so in a sense, that's the kind of strategy as it's depicted. This was published in March 2015, so it's fairly new. And what I'm going to say now is actually the importance of having it within the strategy and what it actually signals. So as I mentioned, we already had climate change targets, and they were seen as being very clear. We've met the 2020 targets to reduce our CO2 emissions. The target was a reduction of 42%. We're now at 45%. And that's largely been achieved through decarbonising the energy sector with the closure of coal-powered electricity generation. So you get a sense of kind of what's happening. Now, so I suppose this is the challenge point. So you put it in the economic strategy, you have a vision for protecting natural capital, you put it alongside the capital stocks. So how do you then get it into public policy? How do you get the ecosystems, the benefits, the provisioning? How do you get that captured in government decision making across a number of areas? We believe it's essential to deliver the strategy. We believe it's important for inclusive growth. We know the impact of the Oxfam research around climate change, the impact in poor. We know the benefits for health from people from air pollution, urban space, the benefits of green space. But there's something about, it gets back to the kind of point made by Tony really, in a sense, is that if you don't measure it, how can you value it and how can you link it to the kind of provision and services that it provides? And it's back to this point about recognising it as a stock. It's a stock that's there, and you deplete the stock. Business are very comfortable with the idea of depreciating their capital base or not investing in their capital base. There's a kind of a built-in view that they have to keep the capital base of their business. And so why don't we have that for natural capital? And in a sense, that's really the challenge for within government public policy, getting that type of understanding. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the creation of a natural capital stock index for Scotland and how that's now starting to be used. So this is it's fundamentally the index is based on the value from natural stock, the natural stock of capital, in terms of the provision of services it provides. And when we're talking about the provision of services, we're talking about fresh water, food and drink, timber, grass for livestock. We're talking about regulation and maintenance, the types of water purification, flood protection, pollination. And we're also talking about cultural services, the amenities provided by the interaction with nature for people, bird watching, outside activities. So this is the kind of basic concept for the strategy. What it does is it takes the stock part, breaks it into 10 habitat types based on the European Nature Information System, and then looks at measuring the provision of eco-flow or benefits that come from both of those, from those different habitats. It's available on the government's performance framework. It's called Scotland Performs. If you Google it, Natural Capital Scotland Performs, you will come up with the index, and I'll show you the chart for it. It describes each of the habitats, how it's measured, how it's put together. And this central reporting framework is how we measure performance towards outcomes in Scotland. So it's within a suite of indicators relating to health, education, the economy, environment, and natural capitals there. Now, it was added to this performance framework in May 2016. So roughly a year after its inclusion in the economic strategy, we were pushing to get some kind of metric in there that gave a sense of the measurement point. So I won't go over the methodology part again. Let me kind of show you what the index actually looks like. So this is, as I mentioned, it's split into three different metrics: provisioning, regulation and maintenance, and cultural. So and it's an index based on these, obviously put together. It's not a full set of natural accounts. It's not equivalent to the work that Dieter Helm was doing at the UK. But what it gives you a snapshot is essentially a view about what's happening to your capital stock. So from this, what we can infer roughly that over the period from 2000 to 2015, that the natural capital stock in Scotland has been broadly maintained. There's been growth in the provisioning aspects from improvements in coastal inland waters, and within that there's also been deteriorations in woodlands and stuff. And the cultural aspect of that, so that's the benefit we derive from the amenity, has also been declined. So in a sense, having the index is just a starting point. So that's now part of the performance framework. It'll be updated each year. You've now got a set of metrics which people can debate, consider whether they think this is of value. You can then think about how you put a fuller set of national accounts around it. You can look at challenge to say what it's not included, what's missing, and how that works. But the point I would make and stress is, if you can't measure it, then it makes it much more difficult to link to a lot of the benefits that it provides. This is about the third or fourth iteration of this index, which was constructed by one of our lead agencies, Scottish National Heritage, at earlier iterations. But once you get into the measurement, you can then get into what's happening within it. You can break down the different habitats and look at the benefits and costs. So that's really, really important. And my final kind of points is really around if I was to kind of give you three messages to take away, the stocks and flows points are really, really important. You need to be able to measure it, to value it. It's really important. The monetising of it is another issue. I know there's a different debate around whether you do that, but you have to at least get some measurement of what you have, what you're degrading, what you're uprating. And the reason for that is, in a sense, is if you go back to so what does it mean being in the economic strategy? It means that essentially if you identify it as a stock, then it's something that's of national interest, it's something that should be protected, and then you can have a debate about what's the investment criteria, how does natural capital fit with the returns we get from the incremental pound in education, health, transport, physical infrastructure. Now, and that's important for public policy. You've got to get it in there, and that's some of the work that Dieter and others have done, in a sense, in driving that. So my final thought, you'll hear about the Natural Capital Protocol. There's opportunities for business in here as well, with a low carbon economy, and the kind of growth and opportunities are there. Okay, thank you.
Hello, it's Bruce Howard from the Ecosystems Knowledge Network. It could be argued that in government you have the luxury of thinking long-term, over many decades. But of course, at perhaps the more local level or landscape scale, people are tied to much shorter-term plans. I'm thinking, for example, of local development plans. Can you just help us understand how the longer-term goals of Scottish government for safeguarding natural capital can be taken up by those who have to have much shorter timeframes to work in?
Yep. So essentially, there's 2 points in that. The luxury of time within government. If it was a government minister was here, they would probably say there isn't a luxury of time. You have a long-term strategy, but you're judged over a relatively short period of time. So what's the point of... So at the national level, you have a target for it, and obviously most of the issues are local. Most of the issues are related to decisions around forestry, planning, peatlands, and the kind of implementation of that at the local level, which is done through the agencies. But the point, I think, about having the national indicator is that drives resources through these agencies. It drives the prominence of it. And in a sense, if we could roll forward 5 years and we have that indicator going up or down or different aspects of it, it then brings it to the public's attention and public debate. So everything, so we're all dead in the long run, but you need the long run kind of vision or it doesn't work.
Thank you very much.
Okay.